are clearly at this point of what I would call an inflection point as it relates to the transition, the rebounding of the U.S. economy post-pandemic, and the movement of interest rates. So as we have discussed previously, the U.S. economy is driven very much so by the U.S. consumer. So the U.S. consumer is a very important component to this. And if we look at our presentation here on page 2, we can see, looking at the levels of consumer spending, that on the blue line, they have returned to pre-COVID levels. However, again, we have this trend of the consumer spending being concentrated in the goods sector, and of course this is a continuation of the slow return to a pre-COVID economy, where folks are continuing to spend their dollars on goods as opposed to services. And we can see that in the gray line, with the level of consumer spending in the service sector remaining depressed relative to where it was pre-pandemic. And this lower level of service spending is, partially also a reflection of the fact that many of the areas of the service industry have not been able to return back to 100% either capacity or completely reopen. Clearly, when we think in terms of the service sector, much of that is the small business area, as well as just the leisure and hospitality sectors. So when we flip to the next page and we look at the employment picture, again, we kind of have a good news, not so great news story here, in that jobs have returned to some degree, but we have not regained jobs to the extent that we had lost as a result of the initial shutdowns. So at this stage, we still have about 8 million Americans who are still unemployed. And that is feeding into the Fed's message and commitment to keeping interest rates lower for longer, because the Fed's has a mandate from their congressional authority, which dictates that they must move to assist the U.S. economy to achieve full employment. And so full employment, in their view, has been identified as getting the unemployment rate back down to where it was previously, which is around 3.5%. We're currently at 6%. But additionally, they've expanded that definition to include a concept referred to as maximum employment, which means employment across the various wage classes. So when we look at the employment levels for what are classified as high wage earners, which are folks earning more than $60,000 per year, those employment levels are back to where they were pre-pandemic. But when we look at the lower wage earners, which are those earning less than $24,000 per year, those employment levels are still around 20% below pre-pandemic levels. So again, the ability of the service sector to reopen and to reemploy folks will certainly go a long way to the U.S. economy returning back to full employment and additionally maximum employment. And that will then allow the Fed to start to consider or start to actually move on raising those short-term interest rates. Now, if we look at the next page with the U.S. Treasury yield curves, this gives us an indication of where U.S. Treasury rates are across the maturity spectrum. The blue line is the level of interest rates as of the end of March. The gray line is as of the end of 2019, which we would characterize as, pre-pandemic, and the end of 2020, of course, is just a reference to where rates were when we last presented here. But we can see, looking at the blue line, the longer-term rates have increased, and pretty much from a longer-term perspective are pretty close to where they were back in 2019. And this is reflective of the market having optimism that the U.S. economy is on track to return to normal, that the global picture will get there as well, and that the prospect for increased inflation is perhaps on the horizon. The steepness of the yield curve, meaning that the short-term interest rates are very anchored to zero. As we go out the maturity spectrum, those rates are higher. That steepness is reflective of the fact that the Fed is keeping those short-term interest rates anchored in that 0 to 0.25% range. But yet, as I said, the market is also anticipating that the Fed will be in a position to start to return those rates back to normal. And so when we think in terms of what is normal and what has the Fed communicated to the marketplace as it relates to when that may occur, we can look to the next page, which is the forecast that the Federal Reserve does issue on a quarterly basis. They do meet 8 times a year, but they only issue a forecast 4 times a year. And as a matter of fact, they just wrapped up a 2-day meeting yesterday. But this forecast for March is the most current one that we have to get a feel for really what are they projecting for the U.S. economy, not only for the GDP, which is a measure of economic activity, but the unemployment rate and the inflation rate, and then as well as where they expect that short-term interest rate will be. And so we can see, looking at under 2021, 22, and 23, that the Fed is clearly expecting, as I think many market participants are, that 2021 will be a year of very much so increased economic activity, well above trend levels. And when we think of trend levels, historically the U.S. economy has expanded at a rate of around 2.5% to 3%. In 2021, at least the Fed's expectations are that we will be at 6.5%. I believe the first quarter 2021 GDP numbers perhaps came out while I was in the car driving, but I know the expectations were for the first quarter that it would be in excess of 6%. So clearly, 2021 being rather a return of economic activity, a release of some pent-up demand, as it related to the fact that, through 2020, economic activity was rather depressed. But looking ahead to 2022 and 2023, the expectations are that growth will return back to these trend levels. The unemployment rate, when we look at the Fed's forecast, we can see they're projecting that in 2021 unemployment will only drop to 4.5%. So still some ways to go till it meets their mandate of full employment, and they're not expecting that to occur until we get into 2023. Which correlates with the Fed's expectations that they have communicated that they will keep interest rates on the short end on hold through 2023. Now, we want to always consider that this is a forecast, and 2023 is 2 years from now, and a lot can change, between that time. But certainly, with what we know today, it doesn't seem unreasonable that the Fed would move anytime significantly sooner, particularly since the expectations are that inflation will also may have a bit of a spike here in 2021, but will settle back down to trend levels as well. So that being said, as we look at the county's investment portfolio, this would be as of the end of March, and we can see that the securities portion was $146 million. The portfolio was yielding 0.99, which is unchanged from where it was at the end of December. And when we compare that rate, that yield on the investment portfolio to other investment options that the county would have, such as an overnight account with the Star Ohio investment pool, which has been earning around 0.08%, we can clearly see that there's been this benefit of a longer term investment plan. The portfolio has a weighted average maturity of a little over 2 years, 2.39 years. And so again, if we were to compare that portfolio yield, say, to a 2-year U.S. Treasury, a 2-year U.S. Treasury this morning was yielding around 0.16%. So that gives us really an idea of how low those shorter term interest rates are. and the value to have been able to invest funds longer term. And that's exhibited when we look at the maturity distribution, and we can see the funds that are available within the investment portfolio maturing within a year to 2 years, and so forth. And we can also see the yields that are associated with those securities in those maturity buckets. So from a strategy standpoint, our objective would be to maintain around 40% of the investment portfolio maturing beyond 3 years. That can allow us to take advantage of that steepness in the yield curve where the market has already priced in optimism, and limit the amount of reinvestment here in the shorter term as interest rates remain very low, and we anticipate will continue to do so. So that being said, are there any questions, comments?
I do have a question or two.
Sure.
You mentioned the service sector.
Mm-hmm.
Employment has not returned, bounced back as quickly as other sectors. Historically, the service sector's average income per employee generally has trailed other sectors.
Yes.
For a number of reasons. Could that lack of a bounce back, as far as employment levels are concerned, be somewhat the result of overly enthusiastic government benevolence, if you will? And are there any studies that would indicate that? If that's the case.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. And I know just anecdotally, in my circle of, we know of many folks who own small businesses, and the common theme we have heard is that people, small businesses are having to compete with unemployment benefits because the pandemic assistance benefits have provided folks with that bridge that they needed.
Right.
But at some point, the bridge has to be lowered, and folks need to be able to be in a position to return to work. So it's a delicate balance, I think, as far as how will at the federal level, will they remove that assistance, and small businesses and the service sector be in a position to be able to hire all of those people. It's my understanding the pandemic assistance has a sunset provision, which of course has continued to be extended, and the latest sunset provision, I believe, is the end of August. Okay. So, yeah, I've not seen any particular studies where, they been able to identify, are folks not returning to work because they are receiving unemployment benefits. Just on an anecdotal side, I know of a friend of ours who owns a couple of restaurants, and when he was confronted with reopening, even it reduced capacity, and he'd called people back, and one person said, well, why would I want to come back? I'm making money on unemployment, and he reported her to the unemployment office. And that guy apparently, and I don't know how that works, but so the story goes that, her unemployment was then stopped.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, ma'am.
I mean, probably everybody in this room would say the same thing, that I've seen that time and time again recently on the news, that, it's the service jobs and it's the restaurants and stuff like that can't find people. Everybody's looking for somebody. Right.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Chairman.
Sir. Thank you, ma'am.
We're in a bit of a dilemma here. Mm-hmm. A number of our members, people related to the board, whatever, have been suggesting that we should bond a significant amount of money in order to for building projects. Do we have much in the way of reserves right now that would allow us to, rather than Give me a quick comparison of bonding, say, 50 million for a 30-year period, as opposed to using some of these monies that we have invested right now that might be available within the next, say, 6 months. I know that would cut into our future income. Would it cut into it as much as the interest rates that we'd be paying if we bonded the money?
Well, and I think, my focus is on, when we talk about kind of the balance sheet, on one side of the balance sheet, which is the investment side, versus the debt issuance side, which is the other side. And I know the county does have someone who they work with on that side, so I can't really speak to how they determine when it's the appropriate time or method, how that works as far as borrowing additional monies. But I will say this, clearly we are in an extremely low interest rate environment. And so borrowing monies at these extremely low interest rate environments can have long-term savings for many public entities or anyone who borrows. We see that in the housing market where folks refinance their mortgages when rates are very low because they're able to then reduce their payment or extend their term or whatever, and there's savings associated with that. And that's a very long-term gain. The flip side is on the investment side, on my side, when we have, like we are having here, have had here over the past year, very low interest rates on the investment side, this is a more short-term loss of income, we would say, because as we can see, interest rates will eventually return to a higher level, and so the interest income that the county will earn will also react as well. And again, this recession that we're in today is very different than the past recession, the housing crisis, where the housing crisis was a devastation of really clearly a whole industry, everyone who was related to housing, and though it was very much so a little more higher paying jobs. This is something that it's not that businesses have done anything wrong, they've just had to shut down, and so now as they reopen, things should get back to normal. But insofar as how do you determine how much we should borrow, that I would say is best addressed through the, I think the county uses a municipal advisor working with them.
Of course, the money we have sitting there right now that is not invested long-term, those are monies that would have to be invested in the future in order to get the higher interest rates. They'd have to be invested longer term.
Right.
So that's a bit of a gamble. But right now, those monies are at what percentage, the real short-term stuff, what is it earning about? Just a rough estimate.
Well, currently with what's in the portfolio, it's yielding 0.72. There's very short-term holding.
0.72, yeah.
Right.
I don't know what the bonding rate is.
Well, I can tell you that as we invest in municipal securities and municipal notes, and I know that the county, I think in the past quarter, did issue some notes in the marketplace, and as investors, we purchased some of those notes for some of our other clients as an investment. I want to say that the yield on those notes was around 0.2 for 1 year. So that gives you an idea of, I would say, perhaps borrowing rates out 1 year. Now, of course, longer, generally when an entity borrows money, they borrow those monies over a longer period of time, some maturing shorter term. They do it in what is called a series, so meaning, some mature in 10 years, 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, and the like. So overall, at least from what we've seen, longer term borrowing rates on a full series like that would be somewhere in the range of 1.5% to 2.5%.
I see. Okay, very good, very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome.
And if I can just follow up on that, I think it's very important. I believe that's a potentially clever and insightful way to fund this, but the dollars that are being invested are pooled dollars. The only thing that our general fund benefits from typically would be the interest is what goes to the general fund. The other dollars remain, I'm going to say, the ownership of the entity. Like, I'm pretty sure Deepwood would not appreciate our trying to do a definite purpose project using their monies. You know, I know we've got a coupon rate that's about 0.5 and yields 0.2. I know that's been part of our discussion, but I don't believe that the treasurer would be open to having the treasurer's office being used as a lending institution. It seems like it'd be a great idea if we could pay a market rate back to ourselves, but I don't believe we have, and I'm going to look to our legal on this. I'm not aware of any statutory authority that would allow us to do that. In fact, I think there are strict prohibitions.
I would agree with that. I'm not aware of any myself, Commissioner.
That might be something worth taking up, though, with the legislature to see if we could literally loan it to ourselves and basically do something. But right now, I know of no legal way to do what you just asked. I want that into the record. Great idea, but we'd have to work with our state legislature to get enabling authority to do that. Treasurer, on this, what are your thoughts?
Just a quick comment that looking at our portfolio, it says that we have over $200 million in cash. We might have that, but we don't have that all to spend. I mean, there's an example of this is there's roughly $30 million in here that is mine to invest, but it does not, like Commissioner Hamanchik said, it does not belong to the county's general fund. That $30 million belongs to the utilities department, and they like to have that kind of income on hand where they have easy access to it within 24 hours in case there's a major emergency.
So then there's no monies available to the county in any of this portfolio, to the county as an entity.
I'm not going to say yes, and I'm not going to say no, because this was a question I certainly wasn't expecting, that I would be more than happy to look into it for you, but there's not $50 million.
If you could give us some idea of what actually might be available, then that would be great.
I can do that.
And I'm not looking necessarily, would it have to be a borrowing situation?
I would imagine we'd have to make the fund whole. I can't imagine any scenario where we could benefit from it and not. Although let's talk this through. This is where public meetings come in. If we were making the fund whole and the interest is only coming back to the general fund, we're making the general fund, which is making the expense whole. That does seem like circular logic, which is why people with far greater legal and financial experience than me are going to have to give us some guidance. That's interesting. So
you're not aware of any limitations?
I'm not, Commissioner, but I would have to defer to bond counsel for the county on that. Absolutely. That's a very highly detailed area of the law that I've not researched myself.
Very good. All righty. Thank you.